Christ knew who he was. Christ knew the hope that he had in the Father. Christ knew that when he died, that he would be raised again. And yet, when Christ saw that his friend had died, and when Christ saw that those who loved this man were upset, Christ too cried. Now, Christ had faith. No one would question that. And yet Christ still sheds tears, despite the fact that there's a hope, despite the fact that there's a coming resurrection. If we look at this story again, I want you to hear these words again. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. Jesus began to weep. Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. Now, you don't get this feeling in the English words, but in the Greek words, there is a sense that Jesus is shaking. That Jesus is shaking violently with tears. Not just Jesus shed a tear, but Jesus burst into tears and shook from grief. Some people say that Jesus cried because his friend had died. Others say that Jesus cried because he was upset that Martha and Mary weren't able to have the hope in the resurrection, and that sort of let him down. Some people say that Jesus cried because this was the turning point in the book of John. From this point on, Jesus is on his way to the cross, and it's this miracle of raising Lazarus that gets him in trouble in the book of John. This is the final straw. And so Jesus knew what it meant to bring this man back from the dead. He knew that it meant the dominoes were in place and that he would end up on the cross. Jesus began to weep. I'm not really sure why Jesus cried, but the important thing is, and you can be a theologian for a second, Jesus cried. Jesus cried, and that's all we need to know, because Jesus was human. Because Jesus cried, we can say this. For those of you who've lost loved ones and wonder sometimes if you should feel happier about the fact that they're in heaven, because Jesus cried, faith is not compatible with despair, but it is no stranger to tears. If Jesus cries, if Jesus mourns, then it says nothing about your faith. It says nothing about the hope that you have when you too cry and when you miss that person. The hard part about celebrating All Saints' Day is that it's the same difficulty that Jesus had. Here was his friend who had died. He knew there was a resurrection, and he knew that even at that moment he could raise Lazarus from the dead. Now hear this. Jesus did not raise Lazarus from the dead because he was sad about his friend being gone, or because he looked at Mary and Martha and he thought, I want to help them. That's not why Jesus healed them. Or else we start to wonder, why couldn't Jesus do that for my family member who had died? Why was God not there for me like he was for Mary and Martha? We don't know how long Lazarus lived after this. It didn't say Lazarus was healed. Whatever he died from, Jesus might have brought him back from the dead. And the awful thing is that he might have suffered from that same sickness and gone right back into the grave. There's no telling. Jesus did not heal because he was sad or because he saw the grief of the people. That's not how God works. God doesn't sort of pick and choose who he's going to help out and leave others there to sort of fend for themselves. Mary and Martha were no more special to God than you are. And Lazarus was no more special to God than your family member or your friend who has died. The reason that Jesus healed is because earlier in the book of John, Jesus says, I am the resurrection and I am the life. I am the resurrection and I am the life. And Jesus wanted to show that. Some people have said that maybe Jesus cried because he knew what Lazarus was at in God's love and had to bring him back for a moment. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. And he showed that through the raising of Lazarus. What this story tells us, I believe, is that death cannot be relieved of its experiential character as an enemy of humanity And for those of you who have experienced death of a loved one, you know how much of an enemy death is in your life. Though conquered by the resurrection, it has been deprived of its ultimate power. And despite that, though, death is still very real. Death is still very real. When we come forward in a moment and we celebrate communion together and we eat the bread and we drink the juice, I want you to think about this for a second. Some people talk about this as being a memorial service. I think it's much more than that, but in a sense it is like a little funeral service. We remember Jesus Christ. And what do we celebrate? We celebrate His death. His death. This is a paradox because we're supposed to come forward to receive new life and to celebrate, but at the same time, we remember what Christ had to go through for each one of us, for this world, and we want to shed a tear. That's no different than those of you who've lost loved ones. You shed a tear because you grieve and you want them here. You want to touch them. You want them to be with you. But your faith, through your tears, helps you to celebrate and gives us the hope that we need to keep on going. When we come to this communion table today, we remember Christ and His death. We remember that Christ cried and suffered and died, but through His presence here with us today, we know that Christ lives. And that's the tension of All Saints' Day. That's the tension of Christians who've experienced the death of loved ones. But it's a good place to be. It's a good place to be. So as you come forward today, you might find yourself wanting to shed a tear. But also remember the hope that we have when Jesus says, I am the resurrection and I am the life.